Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar where we will be hearing from flood survivors who advocate for Black neighborhoods that suffer from chronic flooding as a byproduct of institutional racism. My name is Markia Thomas, and I will introduce our guest. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do. So I'll start by introducing our call's moderator, Van Newkirk, writer for The Atlantic, where he covers politics and policy and host of the podcast Floodlines.
Hi, everybody. I'm Van Newkirk. I'm with The Atlantic, senior editor for the magazine, and I've been covering floods. I've been covering environmental justice. I am from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which, as you may know, was underwater for a little bit in 1999. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Van. Let's head to Hilton Kelly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hilton Kelly. I am the founder and director of the Community Empower and Development Association located in Port Arthur, Texas on the Gulf Coast. I served as a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board to the Environmental Protection Agency from 2009 to 2011. Also in 2011, I am the recipient of the 2011 Goldman Environmental Prize, which is dubbed the Green Nobel for North America. And I'm very happy to be here today, and I hope that I'm able to shed some light on some environmental issues which plague our country and this world, really. So I'll go ahead and get started. Well, I was born and raised in Port Arthur, Texas, right here on the Gulf Coast. My community is located on the historical west side of Port Arthur, Texas, on the other side of the railroad track, literally. Port Arthur, Texas, west side community where I live and grew up is home to the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, which is called Motiva. Motiva Oil Refinery puts out 633,000 barrels of oil per day. And right next to the Motiva Oil Refinery, we have the Valero Oil Refinery. And then right next to Valero, we have Chevron Chemical. And not far from Chevron Chemical, we have Oxbow Calcining Petroleum Coke Facility. And what they do, they take the leftover raw crude material after they get all the hydrocarbons off of it and make the fuels and what have you. They take that gooey mess and they further use it for like road material. They use it for asphalt and whatnot, mix it up, mix it with dirt and come up with all kind of other applications for this material. But at the same time, when they're processing this material, what ordinarily happens is you get this very, very pungent odor, like someone is tarring their roof all day and all night. And so it's really, really damaging to the lungs and your sinuses, because what you're breathing in is high levels of sulfur when you smell this material, heavy metals and other volatile organic compounds and ground level gases and carbon emissions. So it's a very nasty process, but historically, African Americans across the country have always been placed in areas where there are lots of industries or low-lying areas, and it was due largely in part because of systemic racism across our country and within our federal, state, and local political systems. And so it's just a no-brainer as to how we end up there, but yet at the same time, I'll just give a little brief history. As we know, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, of course, African Americans were free. We had the ability to go wherever we want, providing we weren't marginalized or discriminated from being there, which we were. Therefore, the only options that were left for us when it comes to residence and where we could live were those low-lying areas. That's where we were forced to live, because all the other communities were basically marginalized and pushing us away by various means, through violence, through racial intimidation, and through the KKK organization. So we were sort of just forced into this area, not to mention the opportunities that were afforded to us were very, very meager opportunities. We couldn't join unions. We couldn't be heads of industries. We were restricted from going into certain establishments. We were at the point to where even our food source was controlled, and our diets weren't always the best. So they talk about some of the pre-existing conditions that we suffer with now. African Americans suffer with hypertension. We suffer with liver and kidney disease. We suffer with various illnesses when it comes to respiratory. Well, let's look at why that is.
Well, Hilton, I want to pass the mic to Queen Quet. We want to introduce her.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this year. So glad for deal with all the Hunter children and thing like that. I the Queen Quet head pun the body of the Gullah Geechee Nation. As Hunter can see, I write your pun the coastline and thing like that. I write your pun sentinel and some of that low lying water that Hunter the crack your teeth about. So of course, being a Sea Islander, flooding is always an issue for us, especially now that we're faced with the climate change dynamic of sea level rise. And so we currently have rain. Why? Because there's a hurricane, but it's all the way in the Gulf, but yet the rain is coming toward us. Normally it's getting us the eye and the rain goes to others inland because we are the barrier islands and we protect the rest of mainland United States. But so these are some of the components of why flooding is of interest to us, to say the least, but it is definitely a part of our lifestyle here in the Gullah Geechee Nation, from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. And so definitely some of the history that Brother Hilton Kelly has been talking about, we live it because we live on these lands that our ancestors were enslaved on, but then purchased during Reconstruction and still have it today. And we're trying to fight to hold on to it and be above higher ground. So I'm happy to be here with you all today.
You know, I absolutely love every time you introduce yourself. It is always amazing.
Well, I'm glad I got a fan and a bold and a thing like that at 100 on Yeti me before now. I'm glad for Yeti that.
I want to take the baton on the program here, and first, I think we should all just acknowledge the really awful irony of conducting this particular webinar when Hurricane Sally is bearing down on Pensacola, other places on the Gulf Coast. So I want to begin by extending my prayers and best wishes to people in the region, people who have family in the region, folks who are worried, and people who may not have any direct connections, but who by virtue of being listening to this call, you know what's happening. And I'm really glad to have both of you, Hilton and Queen Quet, here to help us understand this moment. You've both been community leaders in efforts to fight back against flooding, from sea level rise, from storms, from poor wetland and watershed management. And I mean, I know we've already gotten into a lot of it in your introductions, but I'm just thinking a lot about, Sally, what are some things we should be watching for in the immediate aftermath of Sally in the communities that are hit right now and overwhelmed? And what lessons should we hold in our heart and minds?
Yeah, Brother Van, let me also say this, and Sister Markia, thank you so much for having us here today. I want to first say this. I want to send a nice air hug to my brother Hilton Kelly, because as we're talking about this current storm, there are 5 of them, 5 with names, that we're about to run out of the regular so-called Western alphabet and go into the Greek alphabet. I've never seen this in my lifetime. And I have stayed on St. Helena Island in South Carolina through multiple hurricanes and tropical storms in my lifetime. So we're talking about Brother Hilton Kelly being in a place in Port Arthur where they haven't recovered from just, what was that, a week ago? So folks were just, some folks haven't even gotten home yet. And then to have folks in the Gulf. I mean, New Orleans, God bless y'all. My NOLA family, I love y'all. This year, it's like, that's the dot, and the storms are going like this. So when we talk about what do we have to think about, what do we have to have in mind, what do we have to have in heart and spirit going forward, is resiliency. And resiliency spiritually, intellectually, and physically, with our bodies and minds, because people don't realize how taxing it is on your soul, on your spirit, and on your psyche, to first deal with the predictions for days, sometimes a week ahead of time. Daily, you're inundated with trying to figure out what's the prediction. Is it coming to me or not? Am I prepared enough? Do I have everything boarded up? Do I have it sandbagged? Do I have the things I need to come back? Do I have money to go anywhere? All that's part of that process. So now when the storm's here, all you can do is pray and stay if you're still there. But when you're away, if you evacuated, the stress is even more because you have no idea what's going on. If you were at the house and something blew off, you might be able to nail something from the inside and seal up your house. You're not there, water could pour in. Now what do? Everything that you love, that you worked for, that was left to you generations ago, heirlooms, might not be something you can restore, might not be something you can replace, and definitely you can't replace a community once it's flooded out. You don't care what nobody tells you. If somebody does a buyout program and buys you out to move you elsewhere, that's still not your original community when you're place-based people. So all that historical legacy has flooded out. So now it's flooding out your spirit and your system. So we have to remember people need financial resilience to even deal with these matters, to even start to consider, how do we start to raise buildings? How do we start making buildings aqua friendly? I've seen designs for them where we can get buildings that would actually move some, like how docks do in these cases, but we don't have a price tag for it because we don't have people who can work on it. And now with COVID, we can't even work directly with the engineers because we're all at a distance. But these are things that going forward in the future, we have to start to do. We have to start to raise infrastructure instead of trying to move us out of our land and replace the area with resorts and other things, because they will do that. All right. We need to restore wetlands. We need to restore coastal areas. We need to do setbacks, buffers from building into shorelines. All these are components that we have to have in heart and in mind while being Black, while dealing with a pandemic, while being in the hurricane zone during peak of the hurricane season, and dealing with regular flooding, even sunny day flooding because of climate change and people not taking climate action, and then having to deal with finance and all that. So all that's only part of the list. So now it's, how do we prepare ourselves? How do we prepare our communities? And that's why this conversation is so critical, especially during what? A voting year, okay? Because there's some folks, this is out of their purview. They live already in houses that's up high, and they have shoreline homes as second homes, third homes, places they go to retreat. Well, we don't plan to retreat. We love this coast. This is where our legacy is. So if I go somewhere else, I might die of depression and heartache and have some more of the conditions Brother Hilton mentioned. And people don't take all this into consideration. So we got to talk about stabilizing the health conditions for our communities and restoring the health of the environment in which we live, and then sustaining it going forward. And then we'll be even more resilient, because as Black folks, trust me, I think we're the most resilient group of people on the earth.
I got some questions about politics that I do want to ask you a little later. I've been studying Princeville and other towns in the Carolinas, and the thing that like fascinates me about what you just said about rethinking how we actually build is those places used to be built kind of like Venice. You know, they had houses on stilts, they had movable frames. And, you know, you think about like, this is a future goal for you, but it's one where we really should be looking to the past.
Absolutely. Sankofa, go back and fetch it.
Yes. Now, Hilton, I want to pass it to you just to get a sort of update on how things are going in your region after Laura, with your eye on storms in the Atlantic. What are you, what's going on for you, and what are you thinking about?
Before we continue, I'd just like to, let's go ahead and introduce the other guest. I think it's Michelle that's on the line.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Michelle Smith. I actually work with Hilton Kelly in Port Arthur, Texas. So I'll be chiming in from time to time where I can add some things. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Well, what's happening in Port Arthur, Texas, post Hurricane Laura, is still there's a lot of confusion going on. During Hurricane Laura, the mandatory evacuation was called, I think, on the 26th of August. And so people had to, on the 25th, I believe they were voluntary evacuations. And then on the 26th, the morning of the 26th, it was mandatory. And so a declaration, of course, was issued by the state declaring our area in need or in a disaster posture. And also the governor declared a declaration as well. So everybody fled the city. Hurricane Laura came above ground. It hit. It did some damage. Houses lost shingles on their roofs. A lot of trees were down. And but the biggest issue that we're facing right now is FEMA has no plans to even support the efforts here with cleanup or repairs to our homes or reimbursing folks for all the money that they use on the road, for gasoline, for food, for hotels, because we weren't totally devastated. There's a certain threshold that I've learned from an ex-FEMA employee that they said they have to go by. If you don't have X amount of dollars worth of damage to the city as a whole, then individually, you don't have any grounds to collect the money that you spent due to a mandatory evacuation and getting yourself out of harm's way. And one of the fears I have when we have another storm is the fact that many of our moderate and low income individuals in our city will just opt out to stay and ride the storm out. And we're gonna have lives lost. We're gonna have babies that are gonna be killed because FEMA has elected not to compensate people for the hotels that they had to spend their last dollars on. Now they come home, they can't even pay their rent. They can't even shop for grocery. And so what I'm doing at this particular time, I'm organizing many of these folks, not only here in Port Arthur, but in Beaumont, Texas as well, 13 miles down the road, and everybody in between, because we're gonna challenge FEMA on this rule or regulation that they have. And in talking with this ex-FEMA employee, you can challenge them and try to find a way to bring some kind of resolve to this major issue. This is a major issue that communities have been dealing with ever since they have hurricanes and tornadoes. So we got to get past that, or else people will elect to stay in those communities and suffer. So but Laura did do a lot of damage here to the city of Port Arthur, not only to our city, but to our pocketbook as well. And I believe that Port Arthur, Texas, and the citizens deserve compensation and reimbursement for the damages which they suffered and the monies which they spent to get out of harm's way. But yet now, the season still is not over. I think hurricane season ends around the last week of September, I believe it is.
Oh, not September. It's now moved to November 1st.
November. Wow, look at this.
Yeah, November 1st is supposed to be now the official end of hurricane season, so to speak. Yeah.
In November.
Yeah,
so
November.
There it is. And so what we're seeing a definite increase in the climate change impacts on our planet, in our communities, and in our states. I mean, so nowhere is it more prevalent than on the Gulf, because every year we deal with the threat of hurricanes. It was a time to where, I know back in the 70s, what I, as growing up here in Port Arthur, we seldom had hurricanes that would come to Port Arthur. They always stayed south around the Corpus Christi area. But what I've noticed since the 1990s and up until 2000, they slowly crept up to the northern areas, such as Houston, Port Arthur, and well into Louisiana. So as the planet warms up and the Gulf gets hotter, those systems are moving further and further inland. And so if we don't do something today, then tomorrow we're really going to have a really tough battle with trying to turn this ship around when it comes to climate change, and our children are going to have to deal with this. But something else I just like to mention, and that is, you know, a reporter asked me, how did I feel about being dubbed a refugee when we have to go to other communities? And I said, well, very much like the people of New Orleans addressed that back during Katrina, when they had them on the news saying many of these people have become refugees. You cannot become a refugee in your own country. I mean,
Right.
refugee is a definition of a person that had to flee their country due to war or natural disaster of some sort. We are living in our country. We are all Americans, and that's just a way to kind of set people up to be marginalized. So we have to watch the titles that we allow people to give us. So after I kind of, helped them to understand how that works and that title works and how negative it was for people, then he kind of like changed it up a little bit. But yet he said, so what would you guys like to be done, providing you have to leave your coastal areas and move inward? How would you see the media portraying you, and what kind of title would you be more comfortable with? I said, well, I'm not really comfortable with any title, really. But if I had to have a title, I would like to say these are the people, the resilient fighters on the Gulf Coast, resilient fighters that are protecting our Gulf Coast. Because number one, can you imagine if we put no infrastructure in place to try to fight to save the coastal areas, which are being battered and destroyed? Annually, we're losing land mass in Louisiana. We're losing land mass here in Texas. We have to do more to invest into our infrastructure, like Queen Quet was saying. We have to do more to save those barrier islands, because if we don't learn how important that land is and why we should save it, then imagine everybody on the Gulf Coast moving north, moving inward. What stress that would put on the next state for resources, for opportunities, for a place to live. And what about those folks who can't afford to live? What happens to them? Then what we're going to see is the homeless population grow even bigger. I was born and raised here in the city of Port Arthur, as I said earlier. And I remember growing up here, we had maybe 1 or 2 homeless people in the whole of Port Arthur. And we have 50,000, 55,000 people here. But yet, annually, what we're seeing now is a exploding population of homeless people in the city of Port Arthur. I lived in Oakland, California. I've seen a real homeless population there. I've seen the real homeless population in Los Angeles on Alameda Street. I've seen Skid Row in San Francisco. And now we're starting to see it in smaller communities now. And it's largely in part because of the economic divide that's happening, even though our households are placed right up next to these huge industries. Absolutely. But yet, anyway, all these industries are contributing greatly to climate change, and they're contributing greatly to the change of our weather systems, our weather patterns. We're seeing sea level rise because the glaciers are melting. Why are the glaciers melting? Well, scientists have proven that they have found petroleum particles on glaciers that are helping to increase the melting process of those icebergs that are breaking off. As a matter of fact, I think it was just 3 or 4 days ago where a chunk of ice, I think it was 44 square miles wide, that broke off and now is floating in the Atlantic. So imagine, if you will, having a glass of water with ice in it, and you got the ice stacked up maybe half the height of that glass. Right. As that ice melts, it goes into the glass, but eventually that glass is going to fill its capacity, and it's going to overflow. Absolutely. That's what's happening with the oceans right now.
Right.
You can actually,
brother. And as that overflow happens, especially for us who are here on the island, you know this is critical to us, because you are now talking about inundation. And when you have saltwater inundation on agricultural land, we're now looking at food security. So you mentioned the homeless situation and the inability for people to pay rent. What about just even being able to eat? Because if you can't eat, you have no strength. You can't survive. So when we're talking about now agricultural lands being so critical in the South, period, across the Black Belt, this is another reason, if people are not concerned, because you probably heard it like I did, why don't y'all move? Yeah. Y'all in the hurricane area, why don't y'all move? I said, where you gonna run to? I said, there's a song, Old Center Man, where you gonna run to? So where you gonna run to? I said, this ain't the only place that has issues. So if you move west, you deal with fires or you deal with tornadoes. So if we stay here, we might occasionally deal with a hurricane, but which one, where you gonna run to? So now this year has proven to more people who were not coastal people how much harm can come inland for all the reasons you laid out. But then when the salt water inundates the farmland, there's food scarcity. So now in those urbanized areas north of us, with the pandemic, people are constantly complaining there's not enough fresh food where they are. They're in food deserts, you see? So we have one extreme or the other. You have droughts going on, or you have extreme rains bringing the extreme flooding. Then you have the saltwater inundation when you're in coastal regions on saltwater in the oceans like I am. So now what do you do with all of that except change our behavior? It is Anthropocene. So us as human beings, if we're causing all this harm through these so-called industries, then the new industry needs to be a green industry. The new industry needs to be a balanced industry with the environment. It needs to be an industry that promotes human health and public safety above making money. That has been the biggest issue. And that's what the problem is. When we're again talking about political agendas, it all boils down to that. Are you willing to save the land and save my life or not? For me, that's where it boils down. And I think that folks don't realize it when they live elsewhere. You might be on a mountain today, but then what if you have a mudslide tomorrow? You ain't up there no more. That mountain ain't up there no more. So when we talk about food, that applies to everybody in the world. So if you can relate to where we live on the coast, relate to the fact that if we don't have food grown here, hundred children ain't going to have nothing for Nampan, Inland, and things like that neither. Okay, so take it on a selfish note and think about whether you'll be able to eat again, even at a supermarket, if these lands on these coasts keep getting damaged. And if you love seafood, you ought to love these waters, and you ought to love making sure that they're protected and sustained in a healthy way, but that the water stay where God put it and not come onto the land like it's been doing.
So
Well,
we
and
were
also
just,
go ahead.
sorry, yeah, we were just talking about the activity in this hurricane season. Just to add some facts to that, the only one we got in the Greek letters before was 2005. That was Katrina's season.
Yes.
And that was the year we had a hurricane in the Atlantic on New Year's Eve. So we're looking like we're tracking a little bit quicker than that one.
Yeah, we are.
And I had one more question for you, Queen Quet, because I think about like how, you know, you're talking about a hurricane season that is likely going to be extended past the election, right?
Yeah, or right up to it.
Right up to it or past it. Sometimes.
And I feel like the U.S. election is a hurricane in and of itself, but gone.
Well, you know, so I think about Florence in 2018 and Matthew in 2016 and how they materially disrupted the ability of your communities, of communities in the coastal Carolinas, likely, you know, the black belt of the Carolinas. They disrupted those communities from being able to exercise their right to vote.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of people really conceive of this problem as one that's about like democracy and civil rights. And I know you've talked about that. And I just wanted to hear from you about like that, those dynamics moving forward.
Right. A lot of times the unfortunate reality is that our suffering becomes like reality television. If it's not dramatic enough, like I said, why somebody got to die. If the media doesn't cover X number of deaths, people don't think about anything else that's not happening at that moment or that is happening at that moment. So people didn't think about the loss of votes during those years that you mentioned from these coastal regions, that people literally couldn't leave their houses in some cases because water was blocking their road or overflowing the road. So even if they were going to go try to vote, how are they going to get there? And then you have to go actually to the office to be able to say, well, if you wanted to vote in advance, absentee voting, which is what I do a lot of times because of my travel schedule, that you would have had to have gone to a building to do that. It's only now that we have gotten things in the mail. And in fact, I have one sitting here, that we've gotten things like this in the mail this year, but this is for people 65 and over to say, fill out the card that's inside, put the stamp on it, mail the card back, and then guess what they do? You think that you're going to get a ballot next. You don't get a ballot next. You get a letter, which I have over here to fill out, which is the same one you have to fill out in person to sign and send back. So now we're talking about this year where people don't want to go out because of the pandemic to vote in person, But now you're sending these cards to the elders. They're not clear on what all this mail is, what it is to fill out. My mother got it and said, you read this thing. What are they talking about? So I read it. I was like, all I need, give me your voter registration card and let's get this in the mail. Mailed it. This next thing come back. She said, what in the world is this long sheet now? What they want now? So if that's her reaction, but at least I'm here to calm her down and say, look, just hand it to me. Let me fill in the stuff and you sign and we'll mail it. Then they'll mail us a ballot. She was hot. She was heated. She's like, why didn't they just mail us a ballot? So again, the lack of consideration for people's lives and what the impacts are of any type of natural disaster, the pandemic or any of the storms you've mentioned has not been considered. Even us not being counted in the census is not usually considered. And that is critical to how we bring about change, how we get the resources in the communities. Like Brother Hilton Kelly pointed out, FEMA ain't even counting some of us. They're not helping us because we're not a number that matters until somebody wants to just come around for a few days on their campaign trail and say, please vote for me. But after they get where they're going, we don't hear from them anymore. We're counted out instead of counted in. And because it's not dramatic, it's not on television, it's not on social media, it don't go viral. So a lot of our people don't even pay attention to it. And so it's unfortunate, but we have to be able to switch that and turn this tide in a very short period of time. We have to get our folks paying attention to why these things are important, because it can happen again. Like you're pointing out, all these folks who are going to ignore the card I just showed you or are going to ignore the letter when it comes because they don't get it. They don't know what this long sheet of paper is because it's not a ballot. Then what's going to happen on top of them threatening the U.S. Postal Service? So what's going to happen? Will we get counted out again? Will anybody notice this time if we don't vote, or that there are less votes here? Does anybody extrapolate why? Because it's all part of a political structure. Same way redlining has been. Same way Brother Hilton laid out earlier in the history and the legacy of the coast, that these areas were so-called low-lying, mosquito-ridden, and people with a lot of money didn't want to live here until they found repellent. Once they found mosquito repellent, then they all wanted to live here, because who doesn't want to live in paradise? This is paradise until it becomes political. And so that becomes the issue that we have to constantly get our people more alerted to, and that people need to stop saying stuff like, well, they gonna do what they do anyway. We need to end that. We need to do what we need to do because we're the ones we are looking for. So we need to protect our communities. That's with or without a ballot. That's always up to you. So what you gonna do?
I want to take a moment to welcome Brittany and allow you a little bit to introduce yourself.
Hey guys, sorry I'm late. I am a meteorologist and weather producer at the Weather Channel. So we are obviously in Hurricane Sally coverage. So that kind of took me over a little bit of time today, but my background is I have a meteorology degree. Hurricanes and storm surge is originally what got me into weather, learning about why it happens, how it happens, and then the impacts after the storm has passed. Because Katrina was the storm that actually made me interested in weather. And as we all know, once the flooding started, it was almost like communities were just completely abandoned. And I wanted to know everything about storm surge in terms of how it impacts these communities as well. So in my years of forecasting, I've seen a lot of big events come through, and unfortunately communities that seem like they get forgotten about. If it's not a major area or if it's a minority area, then it's like, oh, well, you know, it's sort of like there's some coverage and then after maybe a couple of days and everybody just forgets. So thank you guys for setting this up. I'm happy to be here, and yeah.
I'd love to just thank her for being here, because I have a lot of love for the Weather Channel. I have a lot of love for meteorologists, and I love the Weather Channel more when because they came here and actually did a piece that went viral that was about the Gullah Geechee Nation. The irony of it was that piece got released the same day that I was in California for the Global Climate Action Summit. And I usually keep my cell phone off. I'm not the norm, right? And so when I turned it on, my phone just a ding, 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 ding. I'm what the world is going on, right? And I realized it's all these people tweeting, all these people emailing, Queen Quet, you nailed it, telling them about what's going on with climate change. Yes, right? I mean, you would have thought I had solved the issue, you know, but it was because the Weather Channel had done a powerful piece, and it was unique because they had never seen the Weather Channel reflect us as Black people. So it's really an honor to see a Black meteorologist here. I've met a few that were studying meteorology, and I've been trying to work with them now on doing some educational resources. So I hope after this, you and I can exchange email,
Definitely.
stay in contact, and work on some things that will educate our communities about what is it when we say storm surge, flooding, you know, inundation. What do these terms mean? Because I think that's part of the problem, is that with the broadcast, as powerful as they are, as dramatic as they've become, some people still don't get it. Like, what are y'all talking about though? What you mean I gotta move? I mean, get out the way of what? You know, it's water, right? You know, yeah, but that's water that you can't stand up in. Like, you know, so it's so important. So I'm so happy that you joined us, and glad that you were able to, because of what Sally is doing right now. Sally, the act up and thing, Sally, what's it in the Sally what been on TV back on her. And I act up too now.
Brittany, I mean, journalist to journalist, to me, your mission of making sure that people have an eye on what's going on in communities that otherwise, you know, there's not a whole lot of coverage, just like Queen Quet said, unless somebody's dying. And even then,
Yeah, it's
we
still
never
iffy.
know.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm not asking you to like solve the problem, obviously, because that's something we're still trying to all wrap our minds around. But how do you approach it as a journalist, and how do you are there things that that you've encountered in your work that make that task easier, or sort of, you know, ways that other journalists who are tuned in here who can think about best practices?
Right. Well, so in terms of where I am now, I've only been at the Weather Channel for like 2 months. I came from a local station. I was in Charlotte. And when you do local, I found that with local, sometimes it was a little bit easier to do more of those impact stories, because you're like, okay, I know that I'm only focusing on one area. What I've seen with the Weather Channel so far is sometimes if it's a huge event, yes, they'll come out and they'll stick around and really try to engage with the community and figure out what's going on. But you have something, if something bigger and better comes along, so like another storm or whatever, it's almost like it ends up getting forgotten. So I know when I pitch ideas, even just in our meetings that we do for how we're going to break down the weather, what we're going to cover, I try to include as many things as possible in terms of how it's impacting communities. Can we get some actual video and sound so people can really understand? Because as much as I love science and as much as I love showing maps and radar and satellite, sometimes that doesn't drive, you know, the point home for people. People need to feel connected, and, you know, looking at a map, they just like, oh, whatever, like that doesn't concern me. So just usually I try to keep that in the forefront of my mind and realize that, you know, it's kind of our tendency just to jump to the next thing. But these things are very important as they're happening to communities, and disproportionately happening in communities that may be in poverty or may not have the resources. A lot of times we talk about evacuating when there's storms and things like that, but you have to realize, where are people going? Where are they getting the money to go? Like, I mean, it's more than just, hey, well, we told you guys it was coming, why didn't you leave? Like, there's a lot of aspects of it. And I think that's something that in the weather community, especially being a Black woman, you don't see a lot of Black meteorologists in the community. I'm also a physicist. You don't see a lot of Black physicists either. So when you're talking about these things, it's almost like you have to tell people to check their privilege, because not everybody can just get up and go when it comes to storms and evacuating. So I try to just kind of keep things at the forefront of people's mind. as much as possible, but sometimes it is a little bit of a challenge because what you want to talk about may get bumped for something else. In local news, it'd be like, well, if somebody got shot, weather time is getting cut down. Like, you're like, well, this is important, so you have to kind of balance it. So I just try to speak up as much as possible. I don't always win those battles, but I try to at least put it out there.
And Brittany, you said Charlotte. Are you from Charlotte?
I went to high school and everything in Charlotte, so I'm basically a Charlottean now. I worked at the Fox station there for almost 4 years. So that was my first job out of school. I started freelancing, and then I was the weekend morning meteorologist there. So I got a lot of coverage with hurricanes in my time there. And then now I've been at the Weather Channel for, like I said, 2 months, and this is my 4th hurricane that I've done this year already. So that just tells you, like, even when you're talking about the increase in the quantity of hurricanes that we have every year and the intensity of them, it's not just like, oh, one storm here and there. I mean, this is constant. These storms get into the Gulf and then they blow up. I mean, it's remarkable. I left work on Friday. Sally was not even Sally. Sally wasn't even an area of interest when I left work on Friday. Right. And now we're talking about a hurricane that made landfall as a Category 2 storm.
Yeah, I was born on Beatty's Ford Road.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, the Ford.
Wow, that's right.
Hugo tore the roof off our place when I was a baby.
Wow.
So
that's the storm everyone remembers in the Carolinas is Hugo.
That's right. That's right. You can't forget Hugo at all.
Now, we only have about 15 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from the chat. So if you are attending and you have some questions, Marquia said, you can just put them in the chat, and I will do my best to get to them. I want to take it back to each.
Sorry to interrupt. There is one question that someone asked
there is.
like a while ago. Yes.
Okay. Well, I will take that to the end. I just want to get one last final thought from my questions, and we'll I see the question now. Okay. To all of you, this all seems to me, Queen Quet, you nailed it earlier. Hilton, you talked about it. We talked about the historic communities in Port Arthur. That the discussion we're having is about a little more than, whether people move physically, what happens to a place, but what happens to, like, we're talking about rootedness and the fact that histories, ancestors, lineages are tied to these places. And we know coastal communities are the oldest Black communities. I want you all to, if you have any closing thoughts about that and about how I'm interested as a journalist, we can do better at framing these stories as ones that are, more about more than buildings, but about how whole communities and people see themselves and their history.
Well, I would say one of the things that's so critical is just like our sister pointed out, that with the so-called news cycle, how things just get swept away. And they have what we call sweeps too. And so they're always looking at ratings and not at humans. So that's a problem. There used to be a term, human interest stories. I don't hear that term anymore from any journalist that I encounter, because now it's about how many tweets you get, how many hits they're getting, how, what are the metrics on this particular thing, especially on social media. So we have to become more social beings again. We have to become more concerned about other human beings. We have to do that and make that the centerpiece of the story, instead of just focusing on the numbers that might come because somebody glanced at it for a few seconds or a minute long. No, we need to look at the numbers of people and the legacies that those people have built in what are coastal heritage areas, that are cultural heritage areas, and how have we sustained that. And if we were to do that examination, you'd actually learn that there are a lot of things that our elders and our ancestors did that we need to return to. Those African things that we did were the things that sustained us for hundreds of years. My people have been on these sea islands since the 1500s until now. I'm sitting here right now while it's raining, while Sally is throwing water toward us. And so if they did it, we can do it. But as I said earlier, the word Sankofa, go back and fetch it. And we say here, if Hona know where Hona did from, Hona ain't going nowhere Hona de Guine. So there's a lot in the legacy stories of people of African descent in North America and our lived traditions as Africans that we could utilize to bring balance to the environment, because a lot of our traditional ways of interacting with the earth, it does not bring the massive harm of these industries like these industries do, okay? It actually mitigates some of it. And so we have to go back to that and seek the knowledge where it still is. And fortunately, we are still here. We the Binya, we in the Guayna, in the Gullah Geechee Nation. And there are many people in the Gulf Coast who would say the same. And I think those are the communities that if you tapped into them, truly, spiritually, and intellectually, you'd find the things that we need for this climate change, climate action discussion, and you would see lived resiliency. You would see lived sustainability. And so that's what I think needs to be done, and how we incorporate those stories in the media. You'd be surprised how viral it could go, but it'll be a virus that could heal instead of one that make you sick.
I think that this is Hilton Kelly Community Empowerment Development Association in Port Arthur, Texas, on the Gulf Coast that was just hit by Hurricane Laura for our meteorologists there. I've been working with the folks in Lake Charles also that are still reeling from that and trying to come back. Lake Charles is still without electricity, and Orange was devastated as well. But with that being said, you know, I believe that our federal government and our state government, due to systemic racism, has failed us. Has failed not only the African American communities, but all the communities that depend on the coastal way of life. That's because right. On the coast, it's a culture, it's an industry, it's oysters, it's shrimp, it's seafood, it's right. In New Orleans, got some of the best seafood in the world, in the Carolinas. And so if we all abandon that because sea levels are rising and it forces us inland, we're doing ourselves a serious disservice. This country is doing our communities a serious disservice. So what I think needs to happen is, due to systemic racism, that's one of the key reasons why more African-American communities on the Gulf Coast have not been invested in, because they're trying to take those lands back. They don't want to help build up the infrastructure until we either die off or move away. But that's not going to happen, because historically, that was the land that we were basically given. And so we made the best with what we had, and we made lemon out of lemonade. And so now these cultures, these cultures are still there, and we must continue to cultivate those lands. But what we have to do is speak truth to power. We have to speak truth to FEMA, just like we're fighting now to be compensated for the money that our moderate to low income people had to spend because of Hurricane Laura. Even though Port Arthur wasn't devastated, we were still impacted. And many of these homes have at least $2,000 to $3,000 worth of damage. And many people are out of $400 or $500, but $400 or $500 may not be a lot to someone who's making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, but to someone who's working at McDonald's and then have to leave McDonald's and go work at Pizza Hut, that's a lot of money with 2 kids. And so therefore, we need to look at the whole impact of how our communities are being hurt and harmed. And our federal government need to be more, I think, proactive instead of reactive, and think ahead and think about the impacts and how these communities are being broken down, which are actually the backbone of the subservient class would keep all these businesses floating here on the Gulf. We have to learn the importance of those moderate to low income people that provide the services that we all need and we depend on. And not only that, we have to understand the importance of keeping this first wall of defense, people who love the coast here, so that we can continue to fight and look at ways in which we can save this coast. Because if we don't fight to save the coastal areas on the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, or the West Coast, then what's going to happen is we're going to lose it, and people are going to move further and further inland, and God forbid we move into the heartland. There's going to be a war. I remember when New Orleans got hit by Hurricane Katrina, And I remember a lot of people were trying to get out of harm's way, and they tried to cross that bridge into another parish. And those white folks got on that bridge, and what they did, they were armed with guns, and they dared people to come any further. And black folk had to turn back and go into that water up to here to try to find their way to the Superdome. So we must look at ways in which to preserve the Gulf Coast. We as a people must get together and bring our minds together and look at ways in which we could create new policies to push our local government, our state government, and our federal governments to do more to sustain the coastal areas, because it would be to all of our advantage to make sure that that happens. And it would also slow coastal erosion. So we got to do more to get our governments involved, and local governments play a key role too. They need to quit being so lackadaisia when it comes to helping the citizens who are fighting this fight on the ground. They need to get in tune with the grassroots folks, and let's look at ways in which we can save our communities and our cities that are being plagued with these high waters and hurricanes.
Right, thank you.
Now I'll take it to Brittany.
Sorry, had to unmute myself. I don't have a whole lot to add here. I think you guys basically just nailed it, but I do think that a lot of times in communities that are along the coast, you think about in terms of the population in the US, most people live on the coast anyway. So you have a lot of our Black and brown communities living in these coastal areas, and they shouldn't be forgotten about at all. And when you were just talking about, hinting about, you know, local government, I think that's so important. And we talk about that all the time during different election cycles and things like that. But people tend to really forget about the local aspect of it. Like, these are the people that are making these policies. Yes, there may be, you know, some funding coming from FEMA or whatever that has to be asked for. But if you have local officials that don't care about you, they're not going to see the need for you to need any money after a disaster. You know what I mean? Like that. So I think that that's just very important, something that needs to be driven home, and just connecting with the different grassroots organizations, the people that are doing the work. Even as journalists, I think that we can do better with connecting with those people as well, and being able to tell those stories, because how are you going to tell the story if you don't know about it? And the people that are out doing the work every day, those are the people that need the time. Those are the people that need the airtime, you know? So that's all I have to add there.
We're the ones living the story you want to tell. We're the ones living the story you want to tell.
Yes.
Definitely.
We have a question that came in that I think directly ties to what you were just saying, Brittany. From Nina. Nina's a reporter with Guardian US. And the question says, you know, they're really interested in tracking families who were displaced by floods months or even years ago in order to report and understand better the inequalities in post-flood recovery. Any tips or advice on how to do that kind of reporting?
I would say, if you know anyone that's any local reporters that have covered any big storms. Not saying every single reporter remembers every single story they've ever done and every person, but a lot of times some of these bigger impact things like flooding and homes being displaced, there's a little bit of a connection there. There are some people that have kept in touch with folks for years. So I would say probably go that route in terms of trying to find families that were displaced. But I'm almost positive if you do that and you talk to a few different people, you can find that some folks may have had it much easier after being displaced after a flood than others. And those inequalities are definitely there.
Yeah, I think I'll add, from doing this a couple times, the people who run, you know, I don't think like the official agencies are all that useful unless you do like FOIA or state records requests, but the people who do, you know, the nonprofits who go in, the churches who are sheltering people, the folks who you see on the ground doing rescues, they often keep in touch with the folks that they are helping out. And that to me has been an invaluable way to find people who were moved, who chose to move, and who were overall displaced. So that may be one way to get into it. let's see. I want to have we have 2 minutes left, and I have one more question from the chat, and it's for Hilton and Quinquet. And I guess very quickly, you're both members of Higher Ground. What is that group?
That group is part of a larger group called the Anthropocene Alliance. We are the largest group of flood survivors throughout the USA and the Gullah Geechee Nation, obviously. And so we have a massive database regarding flood survival, as well as a very integrated system. We talk to each other on social media a lot, but we also host a number of webinars and things similar to this so that people can have open dialogues and get lived experiences from those of us who are engaged. And of course, you can find us, there's Twitter feeds, and so you will see not only the current things that Sister Brittany mentioned a while ago, like imagery and videos that we're showing you on the ground, whether it's sunny day flooding or whether it's a hurricane, but then also you will see fundraising efforts to help support, like right now, our brother down at Port Arthur, the folks in Lake Charles, folks here in the Gullah Geechee Nation, so that people can restore and then sustain themselves, but also be involved in the political process of getting the word to people all the way from FEMA and the White House down to our local officials to say, this is what you need to be doing. So we go ahead and we support one another and push the agenda further that these communities, as we've said, should not be forgotten and they need to be resourced. And so I'm very happy to be part of the leadership at Higher Ground and with working with Anthropocene Alliance. And I'm very happy that that question came through and that there are others of us that are here listening today. So I'm always happy to be on any platform with Brother Hilton Kelly. We a good tag team. You know, in the South, we like the WWE and WWF and stuff like that, but we tag teaming on this environment right now. And so definitely we appreciate that being asked.
And Harriet Festings, by the way, is the founder of the Higher Ground Network. Anthropocene Alliance spawned the Higher Ground Network. And as a matter of fact, I met Harriet Festings while I was going through the Hurricane Harvey situation. We had 3 feet of water in our home. I was on the road. I ended up being on a show called Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And I think that's how Harriet heard about the work that I was doing in Port Arthur. Not to mention, on my Facebook account, it's Hilton Kelly, is open to the public. I have tons of video and photos of from Hurricane Harvey to illegal dump sites, cleaning up communities and dumping in our community contaminated material, all sorts of issues that come with a storm and the aftermath of the storm and how it impacts communities. And so I think Harriet took an interest in that. And she contacted me, and the rest is history. That's how I became a part of the Anthropocene Alliance Higher Ground Network. Harriet Festings works very tirelessly to make sure that we are connected and that we find resources that we need to continue the work that we're doing in these coastal areas during storms.
Yeah, and that's what makes a difference with Higher Ground is that resourcing aspect. I'm on a lot of boards, but not all of them focus on resourcing. A lot of them talk theoretically about what we ought to be doing, and they talk about the built environment. But at least with Higher Ground and the Anthropocene Alliance, it's about who built that environment. It's about the people and how are they going to continue to have a healthy quality of life where we are in these areas that are flooding.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, Brittany, thank you, Hilton, Quinquet, and Michelle for joining us and for very insightful answers. Marquia says in the chat, if there's any more questions, feel free to email her at mthomas@climatenexus.org. And I just want to pass it back to her so we can wrap up.
I have a question for Marquia as she comes on. Would you give out all the social media handles or websites so that folks can get in touch? We'd love to know who all wants to connect.
Definitely. I'm going to take a recording of this and drop it somewhere and send it around, as well as highlights from the call. And when I follow up after that, that will include all of the social media handles and links and for people to connect.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone continues to have a great day.
Peace and blessings. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.